thank Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today at the Amicus Therapeutics and Penn Medicine Orphan Disease Center webinar, Let's Stop Reinventing the Wheel, Scaling Best Practices for Patient Registries. Last week in our first webinar series, we discussed FDA's role in creating interoperable data standards to help us aggregate data and learn more about the patient journey to advance drug development. Today's discussion will be about best practices for registries, led by our chief provocateur, Dr. Andrew Mulberg. Andrew is a terrific colleague and former senior vice president for global regulatory affairs. He was also former division director for the field of rare disease drug development, registry development.
Andrew, I just brought you live. I think
I missed all of Paul's introduction, unfortunately, so I apologize. Good morning, and thank you, Paul. I apologize, I had some technical difficulties, but thank you and welcome all to our session 2 of our webinar focused on continuing a discussion of the major issues that are plaguing all of us in rare disease drug development. I wanted to start off by having us all remember a quote from Dr. Salazar from the first session to set the stage, and I'll read it quickly. I didn't know when all of this started that we would enroll in a bunch of natural history studies and trials and genetic studies, and that we're all not going to be coordinated. I thought the data would be shared. I thought it would be used to understand patient journeys. How does a child go from being healthy to progressing in this disease state? The system that was supposed to be helping us was actually hurting us. We were learning very little about her disease. It was not a learning system. It was a box checking system. I wanted to thank Paul for this quote reminder because I think it does set the stage for our session today. And I do want to thank my panelists who I'll be introducing shortly. And to kick things off, I always like to start off by suggesting that we develop an acronym that I refer to as PLEASE. And while I'm reading on the slide, mainly focus on the bolded words: promote, leverage, equity, accelerate, standardize, and excitement to innovate. I think these are issues that are all very relevant for us as we march into understanding the very complicated but poorly coordinated development of registries that we all face. I think some of the issues that we will be talking about will be covered as presented in this algorithm, and really look forward to a robust discussion, already having received many questions from the audience. Next slide, Manish. It's been very clear that the FDA for more than 20 years has prioritized natural history studies. It may be new to the rare disease community who is trying to develop drugs, but the fact is that there are many elements that we are trying to discuss, extending from panel 1, including potential incentives to develop standardized registry tools, important communication of sharing data. I think the FDA, the regulatory agencies globally recognize the endpoint limitations that we all and the necessary issues that are required to validate. We, I think, have big issues with the academic investigators disagreeing on key endpoints, and as we'll be discussing, have very little incentive to share registry data. There have been some very important incentives like the 21st Century Cures Act, the Orphan Drug Act, which have helped promulgate rare disease drug development, but it's still very clear that, as we've raised in the first session, there still are too many proprietary registries developed by pharma, as well as even patient registries that don't share data. And therefore, one of the messages that we try to develop consistency and coordination. Next slide, please, Manish. It's very important that we understand the patient journey. Part of today is really understanding the voice of the patient. And we all know the issues that plague our rare disease drug development about small patient populations, phenotypic heterogeneity, inter and intra-patient variability, the prolonged diagnostic journey, and obviously, most importantly, the lack of disease-specific tools for regulatory agencies to assess benefit risk. And it's clearly a very complicated minefield that we're all struggling with. Next slide. I think we're all clear and committed to the fact that with phenotypic heterogeneity, whatever the disease we're talking about has often multiple gene variants. Without development of real-world information through registries, we will not be able to develop the true definition of a disease, which is critical for the development of any treatment. The EMA has defined the registry as an organized system that uses observational methods, collect uniform data on a patient population defined by a particular disease exposure condition and followed over time. Issues that we would love to discuss today are really what is the best way of developing that information? How can we understand the patient journey? And how can we provide regulatory grade evidence which is interoperable and also consistent? And otherwise, we will continue to have what was ably called the Towers of Babel from last session. Next slide, please. The registry has been defined, and we covered some of this in the first session, but I just wanted to provide you the definition by the HRQ because it is important and I think does provide at least a standard by which we should be discussing today. Next slide, please. I think it's very clear what the requirements and features of a registry are, but yet we often have issues with really having standardization, particularly about how we are utilizing a registry to develop a natural history study in order to develop some of the key clinical outcome assessments and an understanding of the individual patient journey. Next slide, please. We all understand the challenges of natural history studies, and I think that each of us have our own experiences. The question for today's session that's going to underlie all of the questions and discussion is how do we move forward? We all understand what the issues are and the challenges, but how do we obviate that direction and make it more productive so that we can bring better therapies to patients who are waiting? Next slide, please. I think it's very important that we understand that a natural history study has a specific purpose. It's a component of a registry that's been developed, and it's very important that it really is critical to the shaping of drug development. Next slide, please. One of the critical elements that was started to be discussed last session, but I think will continue in this discussion when we start hearing from our panelists, is that what are the data elements, the common data elements that are so critical for understanding a specific disease? In order to understand this, we need to understand these elements in order to develop both an understanding of morbidity, prognostic characteristics of a patient journey, as well as understanding how these may relate to development of an approvable treatment. Next slide, please. Everyone is familiar with the types of different natural history studies, and I'm sure this will be discussed today. It's without saying that a perspective is the strongest design, but often one that creates the most difficulty because these require time. And often in rare disease drug development, the molecule's already in a vial that's ready to go. So often we are dealing with data that is often retrospective, and that does create problems for interpretation of regulatory agencies for determination of benefit risk. So hopefully we'll discuss some of these elements about how we can obviate that, but part of it is the development of better communication amongst our registries that are currently being developed. Next slide. I think it's very clear that the Studies that are being done are to inform drug development. They're the only way for us to develop adequate and well-controlled studies. Again, statutory requirements for approval of drugs. They may provide a needed foundation and the understanding of rare diseases. This is clearly being done in large part by patient advocacy groups and clinicians. And also, it's important ultimately in the regulatory decision making. But some of the critical unmet needs that have yet to be really magnified in a standardized way that we will be discussing in our panel is to evaluate and identify critical new biomarkers, how to guide dose selection, how to develop recognition of safety issues, and obviously try to think about, in one of our parts of today's discussion, evaluate the value of potential biomarkers and/or clinical outcome assessments using novel measurement technologies. Next slide, please. So the question really becomes, why should we care? And I think these are obvious points, but I'm going to read them. The fact is that it's been clear that there's not any one institution or one company that can tackle this alone. It's clearly the development of standardized databases would help our very needed understanding baseline of rare disease states, would clearly expedite drug development consistent with statute and with congressional interest in this, most recently by 21st Century Cures Act, and most importantly, evaluate how the patient's perspective is incorporated in the drug development process. It's clear that we need to collaborate and share in these common data elements, and the competition that is the natural course will become through our individual product development as well as our analytics of those data. Next slide, please. So for me, what's the ask? These are issues that I think are my personal opinion, but hopefully that we will discuss. Session 1 discussed the issues of rare disease registries, maintenance of data dictionaries, but some of the important issues that I think we do need to really try to develop an understanding of are the issues of how we are going to ultimately pay for new therapies. How are we going to standardize post-marketing commitments for the generalizability of data collection? How can industry and academic registries truly collect and interact and intersect their data collection so that it is benefiting patients? What are the standards for sharing and standardizing the data? And for me, and I think for this discussion, the FDA needs to set more clear and consistent standards, and that also extends to all global regulatory agencies. I know there are some efforts on collection of data elements and novel tools, and I think we will be discussing that as well as today. But clearly, the future of expediting rare disease drug development is dependent upon novel biomarkers and how those relate and how they can be used to help expedite drug development. The next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our panelists, Dr. Eric Zuckerman, whom I've known as a colleague when I was at the Food and Drug Administration, working on the development and the consistent approach to understanding post-marketing safety in children with inflammatory bowel disease. And I'd love Eric to please come into the discussion, present his perspectives, and then we will kick off today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I first would like to thank both Samantha and Paul and the folks from Amicus and Penn for inviting me. My background is a bit different. I'm probably the only ophthalmologist in this group, but I'm here because my daughter developed Crohn's disease back in 2003. And at that time, we had gone through step-up therapy. Biologics were newly introduced. And just about the time it was recommended that my daughter take one, there was a report of 8 young males who had developed a rare but fatal T-cell lymphoma while on a combination of 2 commonly used IBD drugs. What was powerful to me is when your child has a chronic disease, they stop becoming cohorts, and when you start to meet some of the families who lost children, who lost 1 or 2 of those 8 children, it was very powerful. From the patient's perspective, we often talk about efficacy and safety, And efficacy is simply what our doctor prescribes, but safety is truly our greatest concern. And in IBD, 90% of the drugs used are used off-label in children. And in fact, even today, it takes over 9 years for adult labeling to reach and be developed for pediatric labeling. And sadly, more patients today die from off-label use in IBD than in any other disease. Clearly, we can do better. And at Parents, we came together to try to move this agenda forward. The first step was really understanding the hurdles in pediatric labeling. We brought stakeholders together. We included regulators from the get-go. We reached out to professional organizations, researchers, and industry. And we published a manuscript basically on what were the hurdles in pediatric labeling, and one of which was standardized safety data and following children longitudinally. And Andrew, I believe, was at FDA at the time, but I presented the model for the CREATE registry, or the Children's Registry, in an effort to standardize data, collect safety data, and then be able to share it with others. In keeping with the theme of this program, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I reached out to Laura Schomburg, who had just launched the CARA registry back around 2014, and from the successes of pediatric oncology, decided to move this agenda forward. Of interest, between 2003 and 2010, of the 100 cases of T-cell lymphoma associated with biologics, 45 were in IBD, but 55 were in JIA and dermatology, which did beg the question, can we share data or data points among disciplines? And if why not? And it becomes the question, and I think the purpose of this session. So to keep everyone together, we started to concentrate on the goal. We developed a partnership with the Critical Path Institute, 6 pharmaceutical companies, NASPGHAN, which is the professional organization that represents 1,400 GI doctors in the United States. And we started to move this project forward. Moving this agenda forward, we realized that everyone needs to have a seat at the table. And we want to make sure that everyone is involved and we understand their concerns. I think what has made us successful to this point is the Pediatric IBD Foundation is a foundation of parents. We have no ownership interest. Our goal was basically to bring stakeholders together, launch this, and get out of their way. And I think CREATE presents a unique opportunity for IBD colleagues and competitors to really get together in the best interest of children, and developed a longitudinal safety registry to follow children throughout their lives, and that will be hopefully for many decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome to the panel as panel number 1. Before we introduce Dr. Larkindale, I wanted to just quote from one of her papers, where she said, development of non-proprietary disease-based registries should be encouraged and facilitated in conjunction with patient advocacy groups. Likewise, innovative study designs and collaboration between stakeholders outside commercial therapy development offer an option for efficiently generating data sets on patient natural history and improving the accuracy of simulations. Next slide. Dr. Jane Larkindale is critically a mover and a shaker in this arena. An esteemed colleague from the Critical Path Institute. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Larkindale to be part of this panel. And Jane, please allow yourself the time to introduce yourself and your discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. And again, thank you to the organizers for giving an opportunity to. I do think this is a very important topic. So my background is I'm the Executive Director of the Rare Disease Cures Accelerated Data and Analytics Platform at the Critical Path Institute. And I also lead a number of other rare disease programs at CPATH. And previously, I've worked for a couple of different nonprofit research organizations where really everything I've been doing for the last 20 years has been about trying to accelerate drug development across rare diseases. And I think collection of standardized data and getting access to that data is an absolute critical part to moving therapy development forwards. If you have a great idea for a therapy, you don't understand the disease, you have no way of testing it, you have no way of demonstrating if your therapy does anything, you can't really move the field forwards. So understanding diseases, understanding what interventions do, and figuring out how to measure that is critically important to moving drug development forwards. So I started at the CPATH by running the Duchenne Regulatory Science Consortium, where we really pulled together data from all sorts of different sources. We had to standardize it. You can imagine we now have 20 different data sets in from a variety of sources, and you can imagine the differences between the databases. Some collected one measure, some collected another, some measured things in one unit, some measured them in another. Even such simple things as gender can be recorded in different ways in different databases. So we had to standardize them, pull them together, to pull together a data set big enough to really do analysis. But we did that. We did that over 20 different data sets for Duchenne. We've turned around and we've done it for, I think we're up to 8 data sets in Friedreich's ataxia. And we began to really see the value of pulling together those disparate small data sets to really pull together a bigger data set. Now, we're still not talking thousands of patients like you would in a common disease, but we are talking 1,000 to 2,000 patients, which for a rare disease is a hugely informative data set. And based on the success of those early programs, we entered into a collaboration with a collaborative grant from the FDA to build what's called the Rare Disease Cures Accelerated Data and Analytics Platform, with the grand idea of doing this across all rare diseases. Next slide, please. And I think this is really looking at the problem we're addressing here today from the opposite end. This whole panel is about building pan-disease registries and collecting new prospective data. The IDCA DAP aims to pull together all the data that already exists, figure out how to curate it, standardize it, and get it into a standardized format for use. And as we do that, we'll then feed back into prospective data collections to improve the standard of data coming in the first place, and improve those data collections in the early stages, so that as we go through, we can really learn and use the data we have now, understand the data we have now, figure out how to structure it, how to curate it, how to search within diseases and across diseases, learn about biomarkers, learn about outcome measures, learn about how to model those endpoints so we can really develop high-quality trials, and feed back those learnings to the new data collections to improve the whole ecosystem of rare disease research. This image shows what we're trying to do with IDCA DAP, and you can see on the left that we're looking at all kinds of different data that we'll bring in, we'll curate, we'll standardize to CDISC where it's appropriate. Some types of data don't lend themselves to CDISC. We'll still be able to tag them with standard ontologies, and we'll get that data into a cloud interface where people will be able to interrogate that data, search the data, understand that data. With permission of the original data custodians, they'll be able to access patient-level data and really use that for analysis. And as we've proven at CPATH time and time again in common diseases, rare diseases, and everything in between, you can really use that data to inform how to do drug trials more effectively, how to understand diseases more effectively, and even if you don't have enough data to do that, at least how to develop hypotheses as to what endpoints or biomarkers you might be interested in very rare diseases. But a big part of this project is also feedback to the data custodians. We're working very closely with our partner at Nord, who have a prospective database. We're reaching out to everybody else who is collecting registry data or natural history data, both to see if we can access and use and share data that's already been collected, but also to work with them to help them to standardize data, to help them make that data as usable as possible. I was going through one of the databases we have in-house yesterday and realizing that the same measure was collected in 18 different units within the database. Was it packets? Was it grams? Was it milligrams? Was it grams per kilo? That data was useless because every individual person in that registry had entered their data differently. If we can standardize it, that's an easy one to fix. This makes the data so much more usable, so much more accessible. And if we can do that, make it standardized, integrate these small data sets, and make it available, we can really put that data to work to accelerate drug development across all rare disease. So that's my interest in this panel, is we're very interested in standardization and making that data available and providing feedback back as we develop more standardized data sets in the future. So again, thank you very much to Amicus and the Orphan Disease Center for letting me speak. I think this is going to be a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Jane, and welcome, and looking forward to your participation. Our next panelist is Dr. Laura Schanberg, who is an esteemed academic and is known as an expert in many aspects of rheumatic disease, but was invited here today for her success in driving innovation, specifically in the development of one of the most effective models of registry development. It's an honor to have Dr. Schanberg come with us, speak with us today. And Laura, I pass you the opportunity to present.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel today. The registry that Kara built over the last, since 2015 or something or so, has really changed the course of research within pediatric rheumatology. And it has become, in a sense, an accelerator for research within the community. It initially funded by NIAMS with the clear mission that we were to find other ways of self-sustaining because there would be no line item funding coming. It has evolved into a registry that uses many sources of data, is the community data collection platform for multiple types of clinical research, and works closely with patients and patient advocacy groups and industry. The driving force is really funds that come from industry to support pharmacosurveillance. And as Eric mentioned, pediatric rheumatology too suffers from no real good long-term data on safety for the drugs that we're using in children. And really, has to be a post-marketing, something that's done post-marketing. Next slide. I just wanted to, thank you. Underline some of the successes of the registry. We now have almost 11,000 patients in the registry. They include JIA, but also other more rare diseases. And the registry is the foundation for much of the research now going on within pediatric rheumatology, with dozens of papers coming out each year. And now that there is a nidus of data, we are working with companies to answer different questions that are of importance to them as well. We have, so this schematic just shows that the registry is sort of the foundation, and then using the registry for data collection and making modifications to it as needed. It's being used for prospective observational natural history studies. We have samples that are being collected. We now have 500 samples that have been collected that are linked to this highly curated data. The center of it is this pharmacosurveillance program, but we have been successful doing comparative effectiveness research, translational studies, and now randomized multi-center clinical trials that are embedded within the registries. And these studies have been funded by the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, PCORI, and advocacy groups, as well as foundations such as the American College of Rheumatology. Next slide, please. So CARA's data environment is very much driven by our need to maintain 21 CFR 11 compliance so that industry can use the data to meet phase 4 pharmacosurveillance requirements. And we have an EDC system that is 21 CFR 11 compliant that feeds into a FHIR data warehouse, and into that data warehouse there are also other sources of data from Qualtrics, REDCap, the EHR, and we're moving into the use of apps to be able to get data directly from patients in their own environment. Under a collaborative grant from the FDA, the CARA Registry Data Warehouse development team, led by Mark Natter at Boston Children's, who is also a co-founder of the registry, has now developed 21 CFR 11 compliant fire modifications. So that's enabling the fire data warehouse to directly meet those regulatory standards in the future. Next slide. And I guess I should also say that the people in that last slide all the way to the right, the data is available to people who do apply to it. And while it costs money for industry to access it, it does not cost money for investigators to access it. One of the big questions that always comes up is money. And the CARA registry has gone from being a $1 million a year functioning registry to it now costs about $6 million a year. And how that is paid for is not a trivial problem, as you guys can well imagine. And the way that we have been able to be successful is through, next slide, what I call a public-private partnership, although, it may not be considered that formally, and this is just money. This is how it was divided up one single year. This is not how it's divided up every year, because it depends, because grants come and go, et cetera. But as you can see, there's a large part of it is paid by the industry's regulatory requirements. Other also working with industry through their medical affairs, and then different grants that we get. There's also the large foundation piece, which is the Arthritis Foundation. And this collaboration has been key from the onset. And even before the registry started, we knew and made sure that it would meet compliance for the from the FDA perspective, and had discussions with Janet Woodcock and whatever, and have letters so that we knew that companies would be able to use it even before it actually existed. Next slide. This is just shows who are the people that, and the reason I put this up is just because it takes a village. I think somebody mentioned that yesterday, but even maintaining the CARA registry within a single community also takes a village. And exactly how, to work together with other groups does become problematic in communities where their registry is the driver of research. And our data sharing has to be couched by an ongoing ability to be able to sell the data, in a sense. Otherwise, we lose our, right now, CARA uses some of those funds and stuff to be able to fund other research within our community, to help junior faculty, and we are not in a position to be able to just open up our data without there being guardrails in place, be able to maintain the extraordinary impact that this registry has had on the pediatric rheumatology.
Thank you, Laura. I think some of the issues that you've raised about data sharing undoubtedly are going to come up, and they've clearly been an important, critical issue that often makes these issues very complicated. So let's reserve that for some question period. Our last panelist to join our group today is Betsy Bogard, who is clearly another esteemed member of the rare disease community, and I welcome her to the panel and allows her the voice in the next few minutes. Betsy, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a privilege to be here with you and all of the panelists. I work in early stage gene therapy development at AvroBio, and I serve on the board of directors for RareX, a collaborative platform for data sharing in rare disease. And I also chair the research committee for the International FOP Association, a nonprofit patient group dedicated to FOP, a rare disease that affects my little brother. Jane, like you, I've worked in registries in multiple ways throughout my career, all with the goal of enabling drug development and now gene therapy development. Registries are such a critical tool to get to meaningful therapies. And I've worked with industry-owned registries, such as at Genzyme, where I worked industry-owned registries for lysosomal storage disorders. At Bluebird Bio, I've worked with academic-owned registries in an effort to learn from those data sets to enable gene therapy development. Also worked to plan for 15-year follow-up of ex vivo gene therapy. And I've also worked with patient-owned registries, including for FOP, my brother's disease, where we established a registry owned and led by the patient organization, the IFOPA. And it's this last one that I want to share today as a case experience. To me, this concept of patient ownership of data, the ability for patients to govern access to data, is a key concept in our thinking about scaling registries for all rare diseases. So establishing this FOP registry in a way that it was owned by the patient community wasn't easy. It wasn't clear to everyone at the time that we as the patient group should be the owners of the registry versus a pharmaceutical company, excuse me. But we did build it. We started with patient-reported data because that was manageable for us. Particularly from a financial perspective and a feasibility perspective, it was a manageable way for us to get started. And then we added data from clinicians later. Today, we have 415 patients enrolled in the FOP registry, which represents about half of the known FOP population in the world. Those patients come from 67 countries. And in addition to all the FOP patients who are submitting data, we now have 3 clinical centers that are contributing their clinical experience to the registry, and we have 6 more that are under ethics committee review. We did at one point when we were planning the FOP registry look into building it as part of the NIH's effort to have a registry platform for all rare diseases. It was at the time called the GRDR. So we gained a little bit of experience with what it's like to think about being in a big platform. That particular model didn't work for us. The approach to standardization wasn't quite the right fit for us. So we did instead engage a registry provider, Digital Infusion, to build our platform for the FOP registry, and we established a sponsorship model to create opportunity for industry to engage in the registry, both contributing their expertise, sharing what they need, and providing resources to enable the registry, similar, Laura, to what you just described for Kara. And I guess I would just say that I think this concept, again, of patient ownership of the data is key to scalability. And when I say patient ownership, I mean the patient community and patient groups or patients having the ability to make decisions about who can access the data. Industry is an essential stakeholder in registries. They are the ones who are making the treatments and the cures that patients and families need. They have to be part of it, and they have to be a big part of it, defining and informing content and defining goals and helping to guide what comes out of a registry. But it's the patients who are going to, I think, be motivated to ensure the broadest access to those data. And we need broad access in order to really solve for a disease. Each developer is making incredible contributions, but we need many developers to be working and to not have to collect data that's already been collected before. So I think I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that's provocative stuff there, Betsy, because I think that really is where the rubber meets the road. And what we'll talk about today is that who should be owning these registries? How do we ensure, does every patient advocacy group have the intrinsic ability to do what you have done for FOP? I mean, there's numerous examples where that has not been effectively managed. And then how do we integrate the needs of all, which is critically the pharma partners who are really driving to development of novel therapies. Whereas if you look at the gene therapy model, this has been resting in the academic world for the past number of years, and now pharma is now approaching that and with raising new challenges. So I'm sure we're going to come back to this issue through today, and I would love Just to inform the audience, we've already received a numerous number of questions, of which I will be integrating into today's discussion, which have been very helpful and provocative. I invite all the attendees and those listening in to please send your questions so that we can integrate them in for your major participation. I'm sorry we can't hear your voice, but we are looking at your written word. So the next slide is just to really start and to allow the audience to see some of the guiding, the next slide, please. The guiding points we'd like to address. Again, will be facile and move to different directions. The next slide, please, if we need to. So really to kick this off, we have obviously panelists who have been able to present on their developments of at least two or three non-proprietary registries, but with all different elements. So I'd like each of the panelists in order to really how you've addressed the development of these challenges. Some of these issues you have talked about, but I'd like you to be specific in maybe bulleted form just to keep this focused on how the challenges that we've raised in the first session have also been dealt with. Jane, I'd like you to start because of your integration into several disease registries and the integration of CDISC and external data standards. So would you mind starting, please?
Sure. Jimmy, you want me to go through really each of these questions. In terms of best practices for non-proprietary patient registries, I think we're still really working out all of the details there as we go through the first registry data that's coming in to the RDCA DAP. But there are clear things that are already coming out as critical to make these kinds of registries really particularly valuable. One is standardizing questions to standardized instruments where they exist, standardized outcome measures where they exist, and collecting as much quantitative data as possible, because that's going to be really useful for drug development and really understanding these diseases. Secondarily, and really a part of the same thing, would be standardizing as much as possible using established ontologies and standards. We like CDISC because it's appropriate for clinical data and is very suitable for integrating data. But for other types of disease registries where maybe the questions are less standardized and less formalized, at least tagging using standard ontologies or other standards and common data elements where they exist is hugely valuable in terms of just understanding the data, comprehending the data, and using the data. There's a very brief answer to an enormous question that I think I'm going to spend the next 5 years working on, but that's a start. Did you want me to go on to the next question or move on to the next?
Jane, before I transition to our colleagues, there is a question from Dr. Puri Sharma that I'd like you to integrate, and I'd like all of these speakers to integrate this question. She would like to hear the panel's thoughts on best approaches to integrating data globally. How does one integrate US and ex-US data sources, including alignment on data elements, but working within the very significant patient privacy that exists significantly outside the US?
Yeah, that's a really important question, particularly for the very rare diseases where you have to look at a global population to get enough data together to really be of use. So there are several different ways of looking at it. In terms of standardized data collection and common data elements, we need to be working internationally and trying to standardize as best we can data elements that are collected in different countries. But I think the bigger question is global privacy regulations. GDPR makes it very difficult to get data out of Europe, sometimes very difficult to get data out of an individual institution. And we're really looking at this several ways. Our IDCA DAP database will be in a GDPR compliant country so that the data will be stored within the bounds of GDPR to make it easier to access that data at the patient level as we want. And we're also looking at means of federated access. So even if we can't get copies of the data, we can at least look into those other databases and integrate that data with other data types without removing it from its current location, which can be very challenging under GDPR. But as this panel is mostly about prospective data collection, even under GDPR, with the appropriate language in the consent, the data can still be shared. And this is something we really need to think about with prospective data collection, just to make sure that those consent forms really tell patients what we want to do with the data and why, and get their permission to do that and share that and include that in integrated data sets.
Right. So I think part of this, which again, part of these sessions are to really not just come together with a white paper, but to come together with an actionable list at the conclusion of this webinar. And I know that I have colleagues at Penn and Amicus, detailing minutes as well as I currently. But one of the things that I think is really important here, which is a message already, is how do we develop common data elements globally? How do we develop a language that we all can agree on? And then I believe the regulators, although we don't have a regulator on our panel, and I know they're in the audience, but they can't speak, which is an opportunity for me to speak as a former one. That to me seems to be the easy translation. But I think the onus is really on all of us in the rare disease community, the academics, to help decide how we can get the mission that Jane just talked about. So, Eric, why don't you take on just those issues from your perspective with what the FDA has noted, at least to be an example, including CARA, as a registry providing regulatory quality. So please go ahead.
Well, we to bring everybody together, we did a critical path innovations meeting at FDA, brought everyone together. FDA was extremely supportive, and we invited them both and EMA from day one. So as we are developing case report forms and such, we have sent them for review. We continually get feedback from them with the idea that we could link if we can connect both European regulators with FDA, I believe that will be the nucleus of a start to make this truly a global registry, which is what industry wants, what we all need, because in this day and age, this is truly a global economy. I think that ultimately we have been successful in getting their input. When we did the critical path innovations meeting, we've had FDA consulting from day one. So every time we take a step, we run it by them. They seem to be supportive. They provide feedback, and I do believe it has helped us move this agenda forward.
Thank you. Betsy, there is a question I'd like you to integrate in your response that you may have seen already. Have you seen the question?
I see a couple questions here, and yes,
well, Janet Lambert asked a very important question. And wants to know whether extant rare disease registries for multi-year gene therapy post-market regulatory reporting requirements, can they be used to fill those requirements? It's an issue that's something that CREATE has been dealing with in inflammatory bowel disease for children. So can they meet regulatory requirements, and then importantly, meet payor requirements for reimbursement, performance, the real issues that often don't plague the academics, but they plague the pharmaceutical partners. So.
Yes. I think it's a phenomenal and really important question. When we think about the multi-year requirements for gene therapy follow-up, post-marketing, I think that it is hard right now to find existing registries that are robust enough to do that. So I think some of the work ahead is to be sure that we can equip existing registries to fulfill these requirements so that they're capable of collecting data that meets the expectations of regulators. And I think we need to engage payers to understand what they need and to be able to strengthen these kinds of platforms so that they can meet the needs of regulators and payers. So I guess I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's where we need to go, because I believe that in order to fulfill a post-marketing commitment that is as long as, for instance, a 15-year commitment for an ex vivo gene therapy, that the only way that can really be sustainable and the way it can be most successful is if it is built on a non-proprietary platform, something that the clinical community and a particular patient community might be already using or able to use, that goes beyond the life of that particular technology, but really is part of the disease community. So does that answer the question?
Well, we can't hear from the questioner, but I think it was very, apropos. But again, I think it's still, I think by the end of this meeting today, I would love to hear some action items from the panelists about how we achieve what you and Jane and Eric have talked about. How do we get to those points of where we can share data when it exists across extant registries, but they're not what Paul has aptly called the Towers of Babel, with the numerous languages. So I think that still remains the issue. We all are using the same language here, but we're not finding a path forward. On this issue, was there an issue, Laurie? Would you like to add some further thought before we move on to the next set of questions?
I don't know that I have anything to add right now. I agree that the work with Europe has a way to go, and is difficult. And even though you have the EMA and the FDA at all of the meetings, the alignment, and certainly Carol has always done that, but the alignment of the regulations is a problem. I mean, the lack of alignment of the regulations that the EMA has to follow and the FDA has to follow is a barrier.
And so it raises interesting potential solutions here, through ICH potentially as a means of harmonization. ICH, of course, has been used to provide, global, standards by which we conduct clinical trials in certain aspects, control group choices, statistical analyses, etc. The other question that I'd love to address is, in terms of a global approach, do these approaches need to be mandatory? I know that this is something that Jane and I go back and forth on, and I'd like to start with her, because the efforts of the RDAP are just so seminal and so critical, so innovative. But yet so much of our discussions over the past two sessions have still focused on how do we move forward. So Jane, can you address how moving forward on a volunteer basis can expedite drug development as opposed to what the FDA has often done, which is use a more stringent approach? For instance, in safety monitoring of a molecule that may bear significant safety concerns, there are statutory allowances for the agency to mandate approaches, right, like a REMS. So please, in answering this question, discuss the benefits and risks of using volunteer approaches as opposed to mandated approaches.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a place for both in this area. And the big advantage of using volunteer approaches, working with the patient groups, the academics, and industry all at the same time, the big advantage there is just this field is enormous. We have 8,000 rare diseases, and no one person or even a small group of people can go out and understand each one of these diseases well, develop common data elements across all of them. I think with the original NIH registry program, they realized very quickly the challenges of trying to do it all at once themselves. So there's a huge advantage to working with the patient community who are experts in their own disease and have all the motivation in the world to try and increase drug development in their individual spaces. Now, the risk clearly of doing it that way is with no top-down approach. Everybody comes up with their own surveys, their own data elements, their own data structures, and you end up with the Tower of Babel that we have now. So I think where we need to get to is a balance where we harness all of that energy, all of that enthusiasm, and all of that expertise, but to help those groups to develop databases, registries, studies that are integratable. We can pull them together. We can access all of those small pools of data and make them available. Because if I was to start a pan rare disease registry tomorrow, it's going to take me a long time to get to all those diseases. And people with rare diseases don't have time, but melding together the top-down approach of standardizing common data elements, data structures, the sorts of data that need to be collected, standardized instruments, along with harnessing that enthusiasm from the community and the outreach and the expertise in the individual diseases can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And I think that would be the harmonious conclusion if we could all achieve that first part of the test that you've just beautifully elaborated, but that's part of the goal. So Betsy, do you agree with Jane?
Yes, I do. And I also, Andrew, I wanted to come back to your request for something practical, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
We talked in session 1 last week about the definition of regulatory grade data. I also want to raise the concept of regulators defining for us how a data source can be qualified for regulatory decision making. I think that would also be really helpful. And the EMA has done this. They have a guidance that explains how a data source can be qualified for regulatory decision making, and they've done this for the European Bone Marrow Transplant Registry for use in CAR T therapy. And I would love to see something similar done in the US by the FDA. And I think also there's a path perhaps to consider this by payers. If payers can, I think it's more complicated, especially in the US, but if there's a path to be clear on how can a data source be used by regulators, what does it need to look like to be used by payers? What are the expectations? I think that would start to give us some movement on the use of non-proprietary platforms.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and I certainly hope that our colleagues on the regulatory side are listening to that, because without their engagement and everyone's engagement, we're not going to be able to get to that. And it seems so simple the way you said it, Betsy. So I know we have this all on tape, thank God. So it's we don't have to write it all down quickly. Laura, anything to add in terms of those issues? I know you've been so successful, in CARA in bringing some of these issues forward, but please provide your thoughts.
I agree I think we're all really saying many of the same things.
I agree.
And but the problems, it gets into the details. And in some ways, it's not the overarching concepts that are the problem. It's how you actually can. I think it takes a lot of work to actually get the groups to truly work together, and I'm not sure what else to say about that. But the trouble is in the details, right? It's
right.
And for me, as you guys both know, Eric and Andy, that I always come back to the money, because I think the money is a big driver, and if you figuring out how the money would be shared or in group registry, there's the regulatory burden, and then there's how you pay for it. And to me, those are the two big sticking points with getting folks to be able to work together.
Right, and I think that thought promotes the discussion maybe now, and then shifting to Eric. But the issue is money obviously is a driver, but if things were established through a 501c3, as patient advocacy organizations are, wouldn't that necessarily expedite if bringing the integration of having patient ownership of data? But not every patient advocacy group is one like International FOP with Betsy Bogart leading it. A lot of families here, in my own experience in pediatric oncology, working in that as more volunteer and interested party, there's so many important issues dealing with your child's illness, your child's death, the emotion of dealing with those issues. Yet it's clearly the parents who are driving so much of these initiatives, collecting and driving money to be then sent to pharma companies necessarily, or to academics, which is another example. Is that really the best way that funding should be directed? Should patient advocacy groups be generating the millions of dollars they're generating to the academics, or should it be going through a different place in order to achieve this task of what Meredith Berge has asked here about making sure we capture patient experiences and perspectives qualitatively? How can we standardize patient voice unless we do it in a different way to avoid the issues that we're struggling with? So, anyone have any thoughts on that? Is that the RDAP, approach, or is that, the individual patient voices through 501c3, and then companies provide funding through that? What is the right approach for success? I leave that open for whoever would like to take that on.
I suspect that there isn't one approach
Right.
that to be successful. I think that it's going to be different for different communities. I think the registries mean something different to different communities. Some communities have a lot of physician buy-in and close working relationships, like we do in pediatric rheumatology. But one of the things that I learned from leading a patient-powered research network, Pcori-funded PPRN, was that the groups that came in, were just sort of all over the place. There were groups that had really great patient input, but very little scientific or medical input. And then there were groups that had really good medical input, but not so good patient input. And so, I think one of the reasons that that program wasn't totally successful was that there wasn't one way to approach the problem that would work for the different groups, because you have to think about where each group is coming from, what they need the registry for, and who the stakeholders are, because the stakeholders are not the same in every community.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Laura, there. I think it really just depends on the purpose and the individual disease area. There is clearly a place in a formalized registry for the patient input to make sure that the data being collected is on things that are meaningful to patients. That when you're developing an outcome measure, it's relevant to patients. But you also need the medical opinion, the industry opinion, and the regulatory opinion of whether that's going to be useful as a measure in trials. So in your registry, you need that patient input at some level along with all the other stakeholders. But we also need to keep in mind all the other venues where we should be listening to the patient voice as well. And I'm thinking of things like the patient-focused drug development meetings, where it's not just an element in a registry, but it's the whole story of an individual. And that's very meaningful in a different way, but that's not the same as a registry. So just thinking about that juxtaposition of what should be in a formalized registry being used for regulatory purposes versus all these other ways where we also need to keep track of the patient voice and opinion.
Right. It's obviously critical because, as we all know, Bob Temple's famous aphorism, drugs get approved if they impact fields, functions, and survives. And without understanding those particular elements of a patient's journey, as you enumerated here, we're not going to get to that. But it still, raises the question, how can we achieve those tasks? Because I'm still struggling that we all know what the problems are, yet we haven't yet defined the path of how to get there most expeditiously. I understand there's heterogeneity in what's needed by individual groups, but really, how does the panel feel we best can move forward with the fact that we have a society in which we have the nature of what it is, competition drives our economy, yet we all are necessarily repeating what everyone's efforts are and leading to patient exhaustion and family exhaustion and really not achieving any more expedited development. So are there any thoughts of the panelists on how to, yes, we know what the problems are. We've known that you've each succeeded in your own individual areas, but the point of these discussions are to take your success and how to really bring that path forward for others who are trying to drive to that success. So Eric, would you like to start with that?
I think you have to make it so that it is attractive for everyone to buy in. I think you want to create a situation that nobody wants to be excluded from. The problem we have in IBD is we are one of the better funded rare diseases. So there is a lot of money that goes into interest. I think one of the presenters in the first session kind of highlighted that the interests are sometimes affected by the money and how the money is in fact received. I think if we could start to formulate a working area where all of us are willing to kind of open up a little bit to be able to share the information. Patients are clueless. We think that there is more collaboration among the interests in IBD than truly that there is. and we support different organizations. There's probably, I'm an ophthalmologist, there's probably more organizations in IBD, even though it's a rare disease, than we do have in ophthalmology. And I think if we could start to find common ground, and I think safety is something very hard to argue against in terms of enhancing safety surveillance. And I think given the fact that some of these therapies, at least in IBD, start in the first decade of life, there's no products approved, for children under the age of 6, can we start to collect that information and join forces and realize this is now a global economy, very different than 20 years ago when at least my journey started to begin. I think we could start to move to the next step.
Thank you.
I think your point, Eric, about safety being, one of the things that potentially joins groups together, as we've talked about, I think is a good one. Everybody is interested in safety. All the stakeholders are interested in safety. And safety, when the drugs cross diseases, that's also another reason to way that looking at safety could also cross rare diseases.
Right. So let's go into that before. Oh, go ahead, Eric. I'm sorry.
And going back to Laura's point, I think if we have commonalities such as we have in JIA and IBD, where drugs are used in a similar purpose, I think it starts to build some of those bridges among disciplines, which I think could be applicable to rare disease data sharing.
Betsy, were you going to make some comments? Otherwise, I'll wait for you to finish.
I just wanted to come back to your comment about the exhaustion, because it's real. And I think solving the exhaustion, some of that is within each community. And the exhaustion comes from multiple stakeholders, researchers, companies asking the same patient community to answer the same questions or slightly similar questions, but then taking the data and using it for their own purposes. And I think some of that solution, that's where some of this problem is coming from. And that's where if patients can have this role in governing access to data, once they answer a certain set of questions, they have the ability to then say, please don't ask us those questions again. We have the answers. We'll give them to you. Ask us some new questions. We'll give you new information. And I guess that's where I see this role of governance to access being so important, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, and it's critical. And I know that we're approaching at least the last few minutes, and I wanted to get to one important issue that dovetails with Eric and Laura with regards to the development of communication across and common areas across rare diseases. And when you look at specific diseases, of course, there's uniqueness in JRA, there's uniqueness in IBD, there's common elements there. But when you talk about neurodegenerative disorders, there's often very many common, functional endpoints. How can the panel think about us approaching, scalable data so that we don't have replication continuously of, and again, to the common COA that I know the FDA is starting to look at. Can we start utilizing these novel technologies that are being developed by, external partners? And I won't mention names just for the sake of not providing any potential for bias. But in terms of electronic data recording, looking at functional data, looking at common complaints, signs and symptoms that transverse multiple diseases, how can we utilize that as a means of moving forward? In addition to what Betsy's talking about, which is to reduce patient burden, which is part and parcel of them being asked the same darn questions by every sponsor who makes them sign a consent form, go through the same process. We are wasting so much time, right? Please, whoever would like to start on that. Jane, you haven't spoken for a few minutes, please.
Sure. So I think in terms of accessing and using data across different diseases, that's a topic we've been thinking about and talking about a lot. And we have a proto-consortium, if you will, at CPATH, really talking about clinical outcome assessments that could be used across rare diseases. And I think the huge thing there is community consensus and driving consensus. That consortium hasn't completely launched yet, but I know it's already got a huge number of companies talking together about common clinical outcome assessments and how they could be used across different diseases. And by driving that consensus and suggesting people collect the same tools, the same instruments, the same kinds of data, and then sharing them on, will really move towards a much more interoperable world. But that requires consensus. That project is also being supported by FDA, and having the driving force being there from the regulators will help a lot. The other side of it, and this is some pilot work we're already doing in our DCA DAP, is demonstrating the utility of using data across different disease spaces. We have a prototype going, actually looking at data from polycystic kidney disease and kidney transplant, which is a funny area to start with, but just demonstrating how you can use data, how you can explore data using AI machine learning across different diseases and learn more. And I think as we see case studies, that'll become more clear and help people really understand why we want to move towards these common standards and common structures. But I think a big thing that we need to be doing as a community as a next step is sitting down and writing out, here are our best recommendations for new registries as you start to collect data. Let's make them interoperable from the start, at the same time as we do what we can with the data that already exists.
Yeah, I think that's critical, Jane. The question, of course, is where do we start that? Do we start that at the electronic health record perspective of the hospitals that are clinicians are monitoring these children? Are we starting at the pharma level? It's clear that we have to do these things. Are we starting at NCATs, who are funding these academics to start their own research? Where do we start? It's the chicken and egg. But I'm a firm believer in top-down, frankly. I think most of the work comes from, obviously, the levels are doing all of the work, but if we don't mandate, and that's why I think that something I do feel strongly about, love to talk about at this time, is how do we get to that point of what you're saying? Who do we bring together to ensure that this happens if we don't do a top-down approach?
I would say in some ways we've already started that. We're having this discussion here. The FDA is part of the discussion through RDCA DAP. RareX is pulling together another group, beginning to look at standardizing data. And I think we've started. Now we just need to pull those groups together and have a common message. And I know I've been involved in a lot of discussions with NORD, with RareX, with other groups that are trying to do similar things. So we have a common discussion rather than, well, we all want standards, but I want my standards. So I think we've started, but a long way to go yet.
All right, that's great, because that does answer a question of Jane Lambert, who wanted Betsy to talk about, how RareX distinguished from CPATH's efforts. But I think you just answered that the key stakeholders are getting together, and the question is how to move that forward, even more expeditiously. Were there other comments on this particular question? I think we've been allowed another 15 minutes or so, or as long as it takes, that we all don't become exhausted talking, whichever comes first. But I think that I'd like to spend the next part of this is to really push the subject again about how do we start standardizing, these data elements, and how do we get academics, children's hospitals, for instance. Has there been any concerted effort, knowing that, for instance, there is a clear federation of children's hospitals? CEOs gather, multiple times, I'm sure, during the year. When I was at CHOP, I remember that this was, clearly going on, knowing that CHOP and Boston Children's and Denver and all the children's hospitals, at least in the United States, how do we integrate the electronic health record databases and that voice to start utilizing, since they clearly mandate to the academic institutions, here's what system you must use, and they populate those electronic health records. It seems like some groups that Eric works with the Improved Care Now network in pediatric inflammatory bowel disease, are utilizing this currently. It seems to be an effort that Eric is moving forward with IBD. I'm sure Cara is utilizing electronic health records to some degree. So any thoughts on that, about means of incorporating other voices directly of the academics early in the process?
So one of the things that is important to keep in mind is that EHR data is good for some things, but not other things, as it stands right now. It was not developed to do research. The companies didn't make it research friendly, and it really isn't. continues to be really poor sources of actually what drugs people are on, as hard as that is to believe, and when the drugs start and stop. It is also a really poor source of adverse events. So if what you're doing is trying to have a safety registry, for example, the EHR continues to be a poor source of data for that. Now, that being said, it is a good source of other types of data. And so, Kara's approach is what we're trying to do is to be able to pull what we can pull from the EHR, which means that folks don't have to enter that into another registry, but also continue to get better data about the safety components by people actually having to put the data in. The other thing is about getting the patient voice, and some centers are using outcome measures like promise measures and stuff as part of their EHR, and that can be pulled. But not everybody is doing that, and there's still a lot of inconsistency. And so it's not just that the makers of the EHR need to sort of mandate, but that we need to mandate stuff to the EHR. And Epic has been working with, they have different disease groups, and they do work to start putting some stuff in that helps make the data coming out of there easier to use for a particular disease group.
Yeah, no, thanks,
But
Laura.
it's not just they can tell us what to do. It has to be both ways.
No, of course. That's implicit. Again, I'm just talking about the means and the mechanism, not how one alters the mechanism. It's clear that EHR has to be responsive to patient needs and to the academic voice and to the practitioner voice. But coming back to the issue of developing synergies and cross-functional endpoints, Betsy, can you please discuss from your perspective with RareX how that's going to be accomplished for the areas that you're working in gene therapy?
Yeah, sure. So I think some of it is as Jane described, that we want to be able to work towards standards in areas like neuro, where there are topics that can be harmonized easily between conditions. So I think that's a big piece of it. And I think that for cell and gene therapy, I think I can imagine a data collection approach for any of them that is fairly lean. When you are in that post-marketing setup, you are not exploring many endpoints to make connections. You probably at that point are focused on a few key endpoints that are of greatest interest to understanding the long-term safety and durability of a technology. So I think for RareX, I think about the opportunity to identify some very lean commonalities, some commonalities in very lean ways between cell and gene therapy that would provide understanding across that technology platform about safety and durability. Does that make sense?
Yes, you always make sense and always are clear. And I think that one of the issues that I wish I had an FDA panelist here, or maybe Michelle Campbell, Jane, to be your colleague here, would be really building on what the FDA has already established through the COA compendium in terms of clinical outcome assessments that are approvable for certain diseases, and really where that status is and how we can expand upon for these neurodegenerative disorders, for instance, or the rare diseases that have shared common elements. Are there positions that the FDA has already expressed to sponsors about trying to have those communicated in a public way? It seems that the privacy issues, of course, IND ownership, are very critical to the establishment of how we do business. But it just seems that if we can make some progress in developing these efforts that RareX, that RDAP is involved in, specifically on the efficacy assessment aspect, The safety, I don't think, is anything would ever argue, and is implicit in all of this, right? That a therapy must be safe. The difficulty becomes, which we're not going to talk about, when you have a sample size of 20 or 30 people, or you have a gene therapy that's going to be followed for 15 years, there's got to be a certain amount of trust, leap of faith, scientifically based judgments that are made from our regulatory colleagues. And they can't predict the future any more than Yogi Berra can. So I think it's becomes a real issue. So I wanted to give the panelists in their final one moment as we start to wrap up the session. So going in the order, the reverse order, I'll start with you, Betsy, for your closing statements, and then I'll close for the session.
Wow, I feel like that's a big ask. I guess I just see a lot of untapped opportunity around registries. The field has come a long way, but there's a lot more to do for us to enable registries to really be the tool that they can be in enabling drug development and gene therapy development. So, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about practicalities around how we can get there.
Thank you. Laura. Laura?
I totally agree with what you just said. I think registries traditionally have been thought of as sort of these static platforms, and in fact, they should be living, breathing, adapting, working together where there are cross interests, but still being responsive to their communities.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think this panel's been great in terms of articulating where we need to go and what the next generation of registries needs to look like. I do think our colleagues at FDA, through the greater Rare Disease Cures Accelerator program, of which our data and analytics platform is just one part of it, are beginning to think about where they can provide leadership through the data and analytics platform, through the clinical outcome assessments group, and through a clinical trials network that they've been asking for comments on that they're thinking about now. So I think the time is right for these conversations for us as a community to include the industry, the patient groups, the regulators, to start really developing a framework for data in the future and how we can make these registries as usable and as valuable as possible. So I see this as a first step, but we've got a lot of promise moving forwards.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. And Eric?
I do think we need from FDA and from EMA guidance. This is a global economy. I do believe that EMA and FDA, there needs to be more harmonization because drug development is a global issue. And when rules are different in different parts of the world, I think that only creates difficulty in getting to where we all want to go to. That is the fact that data is meant to be shared, and I think for the next generation, data is meant to be somewhat freely available. Obviously, there's permission sharing models, but on the other hand, I think if we really want to do what's in the patient's best interest, we have to find a way to collaborate on data sharing.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. I want to thank the panelists for all their great thoughts, and I really wanted to end my statement before I give my own kudos with my first slide, which is what we started with as the acronym of our goals for today. And in its absence on the screen, I'll just read: promote, leverage, equity, accelerate, standardize, and excitement to innovate. I think it's really important that we adopt these principles as evidenced by the success of those on our panel today through their really global and directed efforts in this manner. I look forward to really moving this forward with all of you on the audience. I want to thank the community for their questions. I want to thank Samantha, Charles, and Paul, Howard, and all of our colleagues at the Penn Orphan Disease Center and Amicus Therapeutics for organizing the WebEx. I've thoroughly enjoyed all of this. It's been challenging to do multiple screens, but hopefully it worked out for everyone. And wish you all a wonderful day and a wonderful evening connecting internationally. Thank you again, panel.
Thank you.